You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Benvenue, you guys. What's up? Welcome back to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast. Season 4, Episode 2. First solo episode of the season, and it's going to be a kind of a throwback episode. What do I mean by that? So, I've been reading a book in preparation for Season 4 that I put off reading for a really long time. A book called The Self-Aware Universe by a fellow named Amit Goswami. If anybody is ringing a bell when you hear that name, it may be that he was on the Joe Rogan Experience way back in 2013. If you're interested, and you're probably not, if you're interested, go back to episode 334 of the Joe Rogan Experience and listen to it. The reason I bring it up is because I found Amit Goswami before he was on Joe Rogan, but he was gaining popularity. That's how he ended up on the show. I can't remember if it was YouTube or what it was, but I saw some video with him in it. I was pretty intrigued by it. His ideas were pretty interesting, as you'll see when we start getting into this today. And he wrote this book, The Self-Aware Universe. He's a physicist fella talking a lot about quantum mechanics and all that sort of thing. His episode on Joe Rogan, however, may be the worst episode of Joe Rogan ever. He's got thousands of episodes and thousands of conversations. It may very well be that his episode with Amit Goswami was the worst conversation that he's ever had. And it was very disappointing for me. I had high hopes for that conversation. And it turned out that in order for Amit to say anything in depth about his ideas and his theories, he had to first get Joe Rogan to understand what he meant by this idea, this quantum idea of non-locality. What does it mean when a quantum physicist says something is non-local? And I'm not saying that Joe is too dense to understand it, and I'm not saying that Amit Goswami didn't do a good job of explaining it, but I'm kind of saying maybe both of those things happened. It's very difficult to listen to, very disappointing, and so I want to do justice to Amit Goswami. For those people who got exposed to him through Joe Rogan, you probably never thought about him again, and for good reason. But there's way more to it, way more interesting shit Amit had to say. And again, read the book, come up with maybe 3 really interesting ideas that I want to bring to you from the book, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So the full title for this episode might be The Self-Aware Universe, Transcendence, and Tangled Hierarchies. So these are ideas that we're going to talk about today, transcendence and tangled hierarchies. And Amit's one of those interesting guys right up my alley that talks a lot about science, especially quantum physics, but also religion in the same vein. And the people who are brave enough or dumb enough to do that, they just rev my engine. I enjoy people who cross over the boundaries of religion and science, and he does that. The other thing I want to say before we jump right into this is, for those of you who watch the show or listen to it regularly, you've seen the Two Tongues logo, that sort of trippy psychedelic looking image that appears on the logo. You've seen it a bunch in a bunch of different variations. We use a different version of that every season, every year. That image, the Two Tongues image, was inspired by Amit Goswami. I want you guys to know that. His being introduced to his ideas really blew my mind and inspired that image. So there's more to it than that, but I'll leave it at there. And we'll jump into the self-aware universe. So again, I don't know how much I have to repeat or re-explain these quantum ideas. We're going to encounter a bunch that we've talked about before, superposition and, particle wave duality and all these sort of things. So I'll do a little bit of that for those people who maybe haven't listened to the old episodes. So without further ado, let me just jump right in. The first section I'm going to call the unproven assumptions of material realism. So what is material realism? It's a type of philosophy that characterizes the modern scientific enterprise and the modern Western mindset, more or less. Material realism just means everything is made of matter, right? Everything is made of matter, and everything is materially manifest. There's no transcendent realm to reality. There's no mystical, woo-woo, spiritual business. Everything is matter and the laws of physics, and that's all there is, in a nutshell. And this bit is called the unproven assumptions of material realism. So we're gonna press on this a little bit. We're gonna push back a little bit on some of these assumptions that are built into our modern scientific way of thinking. And it's not the first time we've seen it. If you remember when we talked about the philosopher Philip Goff's book, Galileo's Error, he talks all about this. Both René Descartes and Galileo are getting a little bit of heat from the modern world of philosophy and science for being a little bit closed-minded. The argument is something like, back in Galileo's day, maybe even back in Descartes' day, the church was so powerful that for scientists or philosophers to talk about anything that was bordering on the religious, if you were trying to investigate that in a way that wasn't through the church, if you were trying to investigate God or nature through science, you were tiptoeing on dangerous ground. You were trying to steal something, some authority away from the church, and you had to be very careful about that. And so there's maybe some explanation why mind and matter were sort of split up into these two different realms. But Philip Goff, in his book Galileo's Error, talks a lot about that. And that's kind of where I want to begin this conversation. So first quote goes like this. Amit says, "Science proceeds by a fundamental assumption of the way things are. That assumption is the very thing this book brings into question." Okay, so what are those assumptions? There's 5 of them. Here they are. He says, "Mental experiences do not seem to be material. So we developed a dualistic philosophy that relegates mind and body to separate domains, where objects are independent of and separate from the mind. We call this strong objectivity." That's this philosophical word for describing this, right? This is the Descartesian dualism. The mind is different from the body is different from the mind. This is called strong objectivity. Then he goes on, he says, "Newton established the principle of causal determinism, the idea that all motion can be predicted exactly given the laws of motion and the initial conditions on the object." So this is the idea of the clockwork universe. This is the idea that is convincing in some ways and allows people to disbelieve even free will exists. And the idea is, if you know where everything is and how everything's moving and the forces that are acting on everything, you can predict mathematically what will happen forever. It's the clockwork universe, causal determinism. Causal, like everything is a chain of cause and effect. And you can see that in lots of ways. You make me angry, I punch you in the face, cause and effect. I knock the billiard ball into the corner pocket, it bounces off the other ball, and the trajectory and the angles and all of that is cause and effect. I put one chemical in that reacts to another chemical, cause and effect. The reaction is determined, right? Everything is determined. He says the third principle was discovered by Albert Einstein, that the highest velocity on nature's highways be the velocity of light. Right? So nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. This is another assumption built into the modern scientific narrative. The idea is that there is no communication, no signals that can travel faster than light. That is the speed limit on nature's highway. Then he says, the principle of material monism was added, that all things are made of matter. Of course, nobody yet knows how to derive consciousness from matter, Thus, another was added, the principle of epiphenomenalism, which says consciousness is simply a property of the brain. So everything's made of matter, and consciousness, of course, must be also made of matter, so it's some sort of epiphenomena. It's some sort of weird side effect of the way the material brain works. He says, these 5 principles constitute material realism. And then he says this, critically, they are assumptions, not conclusions arrived at by experiment. Did you know that? These are entirely assumptions. He says a major weakness of material realism is that it seems to exclude subjective phenomena altogether. What is subjective phenomena? What's consciousness? Is what it's like to be a subject, what it's like to have experiences, the fact of experience itself. Material realism, and for that matter, science, pretends that it doesn't exist, or that if it does exist, it's just some sort of epiphenomenon. It's just some sort of accident of nature. And then he quotes Erwin Schrödinger, who said, without being aware of it, we exclude the subject of cognizance from the domain of nature we endeavor to understand. Isn't that interesting? As scientists trying to understand the world, trying to understand nature, we exclude consciousness from the domain of nature. We're not trying to figure that out. We're trying to explain it away. So again, this strong objectivity, this divide between the mental and the material, causal determinism, this clockwork universe idea, the speed of light being the fastest travel possible, material monism, everything being made of matter, and consciousness being some sort of epiphenomenon, these are the 5 principles that constitute material realism, and they are assumptions, not conclusions arrived at by experiment. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call rebuttal. Okay, so what he's doing here is he's laying down the argument of essentially Galileo's error. He's laying down the argument here that the things that we base all of the progress of physics and material science on can be questioned because they are assumptions and not proven, and they should be questioned, and they aren't being questioned. And what might be possible if we did question them? What new theories, new explanations, new possibilities might we unravel if we just allow ourselves to be a little open-minded, if we just allow ourselves to be a little bit like Amit Goswami and allow science and religion to have a little dance together? All right, so that brings me to rebuttal. He says, quantum physics contradicts material realism. That's the most cutting-edge science. That is the realm of science right at the border where we have yet to break through additional levels of understanding. We're right at the edge of science when we're talking about quantum mechanics, quantum physics. He said, quantum physics contradicts material realism. Our best science undermines what we've based all of our science on to this day. And he's just going to go through them one by one and give you an explanation. He's going to begin with strong objectivity. As a reminder, strong objectivity is basically the idea that there is an objective material universe independent of us, right? There's a material universe separate from the mind. And he says, dualism cannot explain how a separate non-material mind interacts with the material body. The lesson of quantum physics is that subjects and objects are inextricably blended together. Right? So we have this assumption that mind and matter are 2 different universes, 2 different realms, completely separate. And he's saying, no, if you know anything about quantum mechanics, you know that there's this strange thing called the observer effect, and this strange idea about collapsing the wave function. And the idea is that when you zoom in far enough, where you're getting to the quantum level of existence of an object, that thing exists in this quantum superposition, this coherent superposition. What does that mean? It exists as a wave and a particle simultaneously somehow. And what makes the difference between it being a wave and a particle is our observation. When we take a measurement, the wave collapses into a particle. The wave function collapses. So everything on this quantum level seems to be a wave spreading out eternally with some sort of a probabilistic overlay. Like how it can behave is probabilistic, including where it will manifest itself when it is observed and becomes a particle and becomes a localized particle. So when you think about a wave, a quantum wave, it's a borderline religious idea. It's like something exists everywhere in a manner of speaking, and your consciousness makes it collapse from this state of potential into this actualized thing. And the lever, the switch you're flipping to make that happen is observation, experience. It's consciousness's role in reality. And there's some sort of a back and forth between the material world on a quantum level and consciousness itself. And so he says the lesson of quantum physics is that subjects and objects are inextricably blended together. There isn't a dualism like Descartes and Galileo want you to think. There isn't a dualism like modern science wants you to think. We must explain mind and matter together because quantum physics demands that we do. And the next one, of course, is causal determinism. This is the clockwork universe. It says the world is fundamentally deterministic. Cause and effect, clockwork. And he says, the quantum uncertainty principle says that since the behavior of quantum objects is probabilistic, a strict cause and effect description is impossible. Right? So when uncertainty principle comes up, people will often think about Schrodinger's cat. But the idea here is that the wave of quantum object is spreading out all over. And again, there's a probability that when you observe that wave, it'll collapse here, or it'll collapse there. There's a certain probability surrounding it that your consciousness interacts with and causes, to collapse the wave function. Because it's probabilistic, and the manifestation of that probability is determined by observation, there is a conscious role in not only collapsing the function, you may not collapse it at all. It's sort of a choice in a manner of speaking, whether you observe and collapse the wave function. So there's this strange subjective variable involved. And even so, it's not like a billiard ball knocks into another one and it goes in the pocket. And you can describe that mathematically, rewind and fast forward, and it's the same every time. Because every quantum event might force that billiard ball to be, over here a little or over there a little. It's not going to be the same every time because it's probabilistic. It might collapse here, it might collapse there and become, a localized particle in a different place, in a different state. So if you have this level of chaos in the mix, how could a clockwork universe ever play out? The quantum world is always going to throw a wrench in there because of the probabilistic nature of the wave. And probability leaves room for novelty. It leaves room for something new to happen. It leaves room for a surprise. It leaves room for for chaos. And that brings me to the next, locality. Locality is simply that all interactions between material objects are mediated by local signals, right? Local signals. So nothing is moving faster than the speed of light, So those local signals have to be no faster than the velocity of light. He says, if, however, waves spread over vast distances and then instantly collapse when we take measurements, then the influence of our measurement is not traveling locally. Right? So imagine the wave function is spread out over a vast expanse of space. We make an observation at some part of that wave. The wave is collapsing instantly, and that includes the parts of the wave that are further away from our observation than even light can travel in the time it takes me to make the observation. So something is traveling faster than the speed of light in this example. And that's supposed to be impossible, right? So the influence of our measurement or our observation is not traveling locally. What that means, we'll get to. Just understand there's something going on here that material realism cannot explain. And that brings me lastly to epiphenomenalism. If you remember, this just means that subjective mental phenomena can be reduced to brain stuff. He says, to understand the behavior of quantum objects, however, we seem to need consciousness. It seems absurd that an epiphenomenon of matter can affect matter. How can an epiphenomenon collapse the wave function of a quantum object? It's a damn good question. It reminds me of there's something from the Hindu holy books about fire being unable to burn fire. It just reminds me of that. I can't quite remember the quote. But that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call another possibility, monistic idealism. So when I say another possibility, I'm meaning if we agree that there's some holes in material realism, is there another option? Yes, there's another possibility, the one that Amit Goswami adheres to. It's called monistic idealism. It begins like this. The antithesis of material realism is monistic idealism. In this philosophy, consciousness, not matter, is fundamental. So right, remember when material science says everything is made of matter, idealism says everything is made of consciousness. Okay? He goes on, he says, idealists propose that material objects, such as a ball, and mental objects, such as the thought of a ball, are both objects in consciousness. Consciousness is unitive. Unitive of what? Of mind and matter both. So I know that's difficult because we're so programmed to think differently than this, but just allow yourself to imagine that a ball, a physical ball you're holding in your hand, you're looking at that damn thing, and then you close your eyes and you picture that ball in your mind. That those objects, the mental object and the physical object, both exist within consciousness. And imagine what implications that idea has for the rest of reality. What questions does that bring up? Like, okay, well then what is consciousness? Is it we like to believe it's something limited to that idea when I'm closing my eyes and picturing that image. It's limited to that realm, not this realm, not the physical ball. But what if it's not? What if it's inclusive of both? He says, in the West, monistic idealism has been stated most influentially by Plato. You remember Plato talked about the world or reality being made up of forms, the world of forms or the archetypes, the essences, and then the world of reality. He talked about this in his allegory of the cave. It's like the shadows on the walls aren't the reality that are creating the shadows. There's forms. Those are something that exist in nous, in the mind of God, essentially. And then they're the representations of those forms that are manifest in the world. And the question Plato is asking is, which is real? Which is more real? He says, in the Vedanta literature of India, nama denotes transcendent archetypes, and rupa their immanent form. Beyond Nama and Rupa shines Brahman, the universal consciousness. So very much like Plato's idea of forms and manifest reality, in the ancient Vedanta literature, it's Nama and Rupa. And both Nama and Rupa, both the material forms, or the manifest forms and the archetypal forms, they're both within consciousness, God. And of course, in the Vedic tradition, that's Brahman. And then he's going to pivot to the East. He's going to say, in the Taoist symbols of yin and yang, yang defines the transcendent realm, and yin the immanent. And then he has a quote from the Tao Te Ching that says, "That which lets now the dark, now the light appear, is the Tao." All right, so you've got the transcendent, the yang, and the immanent yin, and both of them are within Tao. Both are within this universal consciousness. And then he says something interesting, and this is going to be, I wonder how interesting this is going to be for you. I wonder how it's going to strike you as a Western person, as a person with a Christian background like myself. He says, in the Christian world, the names are heaven and earth. Beyond heaven and earth, there is the Godhead. Right? So the forms and the manifest reality, the Nama and the Rupa, the immanent and the transcendent. So we have names for those in Christianity too. We call them heaven, the transcendent, and earth, the immanent. And both are subsumed by God, the universal consciousness. Fuck, I love it, man. I love it. All right, he says, in all these descriptions, one consciousness is said to come to us through complementary manifestations, right? The transcendent and the immanent. And what I want to bring up here is something we've talked about ad nauseum, this idea of the Ouroboros, this mythological idea of what was there in the beginning, what the singularity was that became the cosmos, what was there at the beginning of all the creation myths, the thing that becomes everything. And it's something that's described as opposites in union, right? The transcendent and the immanent together, Tiamat and Apsu together, heaven and earth together. And then those things get separated, and that is the act of creation, separating those opposites. There's myths that talk about the heavens and the earth. There's a God involved with pushing them apart. In our Christian Bible, you hear about the heavens being separated from the earth, the light being separated from the darkness, the female being separated from Adam's rib. You have this repeated pattern of separation, and you're meant to sort of rewind that process and come to this idea that's this unknowable idea, by the way, that all of the bifurcated reality, all of the many things that exist, roll back up into one thing. And when they do, they become something transcendent. They become something unknowable, this religious mystery. What is the transcendent and the immanent together? What is this generative union of opposites, as Jordan Peterson would say? And in this modern scientific world, in the West in particular, we have a very difficult time grappling with this idea of the transcendent. The immanent, the here and now, the material stuff, we don't have any problem with. It's in front of our face all the time. It's hard to deny. But the transcendent, the idea that there might be something not material, there might be something like a spirit or a soul, or the realm of the gods, or the realm of the spirit. There might be something like that going on. We have trouble with that. We don't want to believe that. And Amit says, what is transcendence? And then he quotes the Upanishads that give us an answer. The Upanishads say, it is within all this. It is outside all this. It's one of those like Zen koan sort of things. It's a paradox, and it's supposed to get you thinking. Is it possible that something can be within all this and outside of all this? And if so, what would that mean? What would that be? And you can try to imagine what that could be, and you're going to come up with nothing. Nothing. Even though you feel like right on the tip of your tongue, there's something that it could be. It's not impossible that something could be in all this and out of all this, but what could that be? And that is the religious mystery. That is how God is ineffable, unknowable. That's how that mystical experience is ineffable and unknowable. So this transcendent realm, you can think about this like heaven, Nama, the realm of the gods or of spirit, the Platonic world of forms, the Jungian unconscious, the realm of potential, the upside down, the netherworld, the noumena, right? Many people have talked about this in many different ways. All the way down to Immanuel Kant, the noumena. People seem to think it has some reality, even though modern man wants to shy away from it, turn our nose to it. But can we do that? Is it safe for us to do that? Are we saving face by doing that? Or are we embarrassing ourselves? That brings me to the next section, which is called Science Discovers Transcendence. Oh shit. Maybe we're embarrassing ourselves. If science has discovered transcendence, we can turn our nose up at the idea of heaven or spirit, but if science has discovered transcendence, maybe we have to take a little step backwards, huh? All right, Amit, tell me, what do you mean? He says, we never see the wave aspect of a quantum object. A wavicle always reveals itself as a localized particle. Right, he uses the term wavicle to describe what something is in a superposition, right? A quantum object is a wave and a particle simultaneously, so he calls it a wavicle. So again, let me just start from the beginning. We never see the wave aspect of a quantum object. A wavicle always reveals itself as a localized particle. Does the wave aspect exist in a transcendental space? All right, so this harkens back to kind of one of these early quantum experiments that people still argue about ruthlessly, the double slit experiment. So if you guys remember that being described before, the idea is that they're shooting photons, little particles of light, through a barrier, and there's only two slits in the barrier where these particles can go through to a screen on the back. And then you can see where they land on the screen. Most of them are just going to bounce off because they're going to hit somewhere other than those slits. But some of them are going to go through the slits and hit the back, and you're going to be able to see a little dot where they've struck the screen. And that kind of goes as you would expect. Some of the particles go through, hit the screen. But then after a while, more and more particles are being fired through, at this screen. After a while, you start getting particles hitting parts of the screen that are hard to explain. Like if I throw a baseball through a hole, it's going to hit the screen right aligned exactly with that hole. It has no business striking the screen way over here or way over there where there isn't a hole for it to go through. And yet that's what happens in the double slit experiment. And the more they do it, you start getting this weird pattern that arises. It's almost like stripes of hits in between places where the particles aren't hitting. You have this stripy pattern, right? It's called an interference pattern. And we know when we see an interference pattern that is the result of one wave interfering with another, or a wave interfering with itself. And the explanation is that the particle, when it passes through the holes, isn't a particle at all. It's a wave. The wave goes through both slits at the same time, breaks up into two smaller waves because of the interference, and then those waves interfere with each other. And where the crest and the peaks of the various waves connect with each other, some places increase the wave frequency, others decrease it, and so you end up with this very specific pattern. And it tells us something. It tells us that on the quantum level, these particles aren't particles at all. They're waves. And yet, when we observe them, when we can see them hitting the screen in the back, they aren't waves then, they're particles then. So we know these are wavicles. These are waves and particles. But we never see the wave aspect. Whenever we see it, whenever we observe it, whenever we measure it, it's a particle. always, always, we never see the wave. We know that it's a wave, but we never see the wave. What does that mean? Does the wave aspect exist in a transcendental realm? We know it exists. We see the telltale signs that the wave exists, but we can never see it. We can never observe it. So where does it exist? How does it exist? Is it transcendent? He says, where does the electron go between jumps? All right, so I'll go back to high school science for you if you guys don't remember. When a particle or an atom, let's say, it's got a nucleus, and then the electrons are moving around the nucleus. So that's kind of the general image that we tend to think about. But what happens is the electrons themselves, they only exist in certain places. They're called orbitals. They only exist in certain places around the atom, and there's a probabilistic means of figuring out where it's possible that they might be. The thing is that they're never in between those orbitals. If you add energy to that atom, those electrons are going to jump up into higher orbitals that have higher energy. And when that energy dissipates, they're going to fall back down into lower orbitals, and that's how we understand them. But we never see the electrons in between. They don't travel from one orbital to another. They disappear and reappear instantly. That's the quantum leap, if you remember that show from the old days. So he says, where does the electron go between jumps, between quantum leaps? Can we assign the electron any reality between observations? According to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, the answer is no. Between observations, the electron spreads out in accordance with the Schrödinger equation in potentia. Where do these potentia exist? Since the electron's wave collapses immediately upon our observation, potential could not be within the domain of space-time, because all objects have to obey the Einsteinian speed limit. Thus, potentia must exist in a transcendent domain of reality. There is no explanation for where electrons go between jumps. There is no explanation for how signals can travel faster than the speed of light. Unless, of course, there's some transcendent domain of reality that we're ignoring. And this is interesting. He says, when we see a motion picture, our brain mind, he uses that, he hyphenates that brain mind. I won't explain it, but just so you know, that's how he's going to put it. Our brain mind cannot discern the individual still pictures that race before our eyes at a speed of 24 frames per second. Similarly, what seems to be continuity to a human observer watching himself is really a mirage consisting of many discontinuous collapses. All right, this is fucking mind-blowing. And I hate to over-explain it, but you get the idea of a motion picture. You're watching a movie and you know that these are frames. They're still pictures, but they're moving so fast that we see them as a continuity. We see them as a moving picture. It looks like one living thing, even though in reality it's a bunch of individual still frames. What he's saying here is that our human experience is, or certainly might be, something like this. If consciousness collapses the wave function, collapses the wave into the potential wave into actual reality. And it may be something like what we talked about with the electron. Where does it go between jumps? That what we think of as material reality is something like still picture frames. And the space in between is this transcendent domain. And we're going back and forth between the transcendent and the immanent so quickly that we don't notice it. And we see ourselves as existing in this materially real world, this world of cause and effect. We don't see the transcendent. It's invisible to us. Something like that. And yet it's there and it's necessary. It's just invisible somehow. Every time you look at it, every time you try to catch a glimpse of that reality behind reality, the wave function collapses and you're back to reality. It's amazing. He says quantum objects must be thought as objects in potential that define a non-local domain of reality, and a consciousness that can collapse the wave function at a distance instantly must itself be non-local or transcendent. Under this simple idea, all the paradoxes of quantum physics vanish like morning mist. The domain of potential exists in consciousness. Nothing is outside consciousness. So again, if consciousness is what collapses the wave function, and the effect of that observation is moving faster than the speed of light, then it doesn't exist in the space-time material realm. It can't. Einstein said it can't. Nothing moves faster than the speed of light here. So whatever it is moving faster than the speed of light, in this case the effect of consciousness, that thing exists some other place. This quantum realm, the place where the electrons go between jumps. The place where faster than light travel is possible. And because consciousness is involved in that, consciousness must also exist in this transcendent domain. And that transcendent domain exists in consciousness. Nothing is outside of consciousness. Whew, buddy, idealism. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call the reconciliation of realism and idealism. All right, he says, the various models for resolving the paradox of Schrödinger's cat are all flawed except for the many worlds theory and the theory based on monistic idealism. All right, so here's another fundamental quantum idea that we're talking about. Superposition. How can something be a wave and a particle at the same time? How can Schrödinger's cat be alive and dead at the same time? If you guys remember that experiment, or that thought experiment, that a cat is placed in a box. There's a mechanism that's designed to poison and kill the cat, and the mechanism itself is triggered by quantum events. Quantum events are in a superposition. They both happened and didn't happen at the same time. So the cat itself is dead and alive at the same time until you open the box and collapse the wave function, until you observe what happened in the quantum level and break that superposition from this wave-like superposition into a firm reality, something like that. All right, when he talks about the many worlds theory, this is based on a physicist named Everett, and he says, the many worlds theory postulates that the universe splits into two branches, one with a dead cat and the other with a live cat. So one resolution to this paradox is that every time there's a quantum event, the world itself splits into two parallel universes, one where one outcome happens and one where the other happens. Like every superposition manifests as two separate realities. Then he says, suppose that the parallel universes of the many worlds theory are not material, but are universes of the mind. Right? Everything's in consciousness, right? So imagine these aren't real worlds splitting off in every which way infinitely all the time, but they're happening in this transcendent space and within consciousness. He says, then, instead of saying that each observation splits off a branch of the material universe, we can say that each observation makes a causal pathway in the transcendent domain of reality. Once the choice is made, that's the observation, all except one of the pathways are excluded from the world of manifestation. Then he says, behold how this way of reinterpreting gets rid of the costly proliferation of material universes, So this is going to take some explaining. So there's a principle that there's a conservation of energy and a conservation of matter. So to suggest that the universe splits off into a million different infinite branches all the time, every time there's a quantum event happening, you have to kind of explain where all that energy and matter comes from. And there's no explanation for that. So that's kind of weird. If the splitting doesn't happen in a manifest reality, but happens in this transcendent realm, in this mental realm, in the realm of imagination, for lack of a better phrase, then you don't have to worry about the costly proliferation of universes because they're not manifest. That energy and matter doesn't exist materially real. It's in this state of potential, in this transcendent place. And once the observation happens, all of those worlds collapse into the one real world. So all these multiple universes exist in some transcendent way, but only one is manifest. Only one is collapsed into reality. And so it's an idealist re-spinning of this Everettian many worlds theory. Or interpretation of quantum mechanics. He goes on, and this gets really interesting. He says, the truly cosmological question can now be answered. How has the cosmos existed for the past 15 billion years? If for the bulk of this time there were no conscious observers to do any collapsing of wave functions. Right? That's a good question, right? It's like, if the world had to evolve over billions of years, if the universe had to evolve to create stars, gases to condense into stars, and planets to, the gravitational forces to begin to form planets, and planets to cool, and all the little things that have to happen over a bunch of time for life to eventually climb out of the primordial soup of non-life in the oceans, and then eventually, after all this time, you're going to have some sort of a conscious creature that exists. What happened before that conscious creature existed? There was no consciousness there to collapse the wave function. So what was the world like then? How do you explain that, Mr. Idealist? And Amit says, very simply, the cosmos never appeared in concrete form. He says, I propose that the universe exists as formless potential in the transcendent domain and becomes manifest only when observed by conscious beings. Man, so there's so much, this goes on, and I'm going to continue, but there's so much here that I love. When he says that the universe exists as formless potential, this is something that I've said in different ways many times. This is an intuition that I had in my own mystical experience. And Kyle and I used to joke about this as, the ones and zeros behind the matrix, that T1000 liquid metal substance from Terminator 2, or the stem cell example, that this something that can become anything. And whatever that is the ground of being. Whatever that is God. The thing that we talk about as the creator, the origin, that from which everything comes. However you want to talk about that. If you don't want to be religious, fine. But you're being silly. He says, I propose the universe exists as formless potential. That's what I call potentiality all of the time. And it becomes manifest only when observed by conscious beings. So that means that the world is something unknowable before consciousness arose to collapse the wave function. This is the Ouroboros, the union of opposites. What was there? What was the singularity? What was there when all the opposites were united? What was there in the beginning? You can imagine it was something, but it's hard to imagine what it could be. What could the union of opposites be? It seems like nothing and everything simultaneously. He says, it is these self-referential observations that plot the universe's causal history, rejecting the myriad parallel alternatives that never find their way to material reality. This way of interpreting our cosmological history helps explain a puzzling aspect of the evolution of life and mind. Namely, that there is only a very low probability for the evolution of life from prebiotic matter. Once we recognize that biological mutation is a quantum event, we realize that the universe bifurcates in the transcendent domain, becoming many branches, until in one of the branches there is a sentient being that can look with awareness. At this point, the causal pathway leading to that sentient being collapses into reality. Whew, buddy, man, there was this movie. I can't remember the name of it. It was Jessica Biel and what's that dude's name? I'm never going to think of it now. Shit. I knew I was going to forget. Nicolas Cage. Jessica Biel and Nicolas Cage. If you guys remember this movie, I don't know, it probably came out like 15, maybe 20 years ago. I don't know, a long time ago. And the idea was that Nicolas Cage could see into the future, but just a little bit. But he could see into the future. And there was this interesting way they did the cinematography where Nicolas Cage would think, like, I want to do this thing. And then he would see himself in like a whole bunch of different paths trying to do this difficult thing. And then he would see himself like die. He died at this one, he died in that one, he died in this one, he died in that one. He got a little further, but he still died. And then finally he finds that one path that's going to actually succeed. And then he comes to and he acts out that one path that's actually going to work. This is what Amit Goswami is describing. Imagine in this transcendent realm of mind, of consciousness, all of these possibilities are playing out. And the one that eventually, and they all exist, like this is like Everettian parallel universes. All these, countless, maybe infinite possibility forms exist. But the one that will eventually lead to life, the one astronomically low odds of life ever coming to be, that one, that's the one that actually creates the sentience, the consciousness, that collapses all of that potential into reality. And then boom, the one universe that exists materially as real exists. It's collapsed from all of that potential because that's the one that leads to consciousness. That's the one that can collapse the wave function. And he talks about this in interesting ways, in similar ways to my own ponderings. He talks about this being a self-referential observation. Like, what is consciousness observing? It's observing itself. And this is what I call self-experience. And then when he talks about that sentience collapsing the wave function of consciousness, this transcendent space, and that creates the world of reality, that's something like self-creation. And this is always tied to the idea of God, the uncreated creator, as Aristotle says, the self-created. And then he says something beautiful. He says, the time and context for a strong anthropic principle has come. The idea that observers are necessary to bring the universe into being. It is time to recognize the archetypal nature of mankind's creation myths. The cosmos was created for our sake. Oh, buddy, right? That's what the myths of the world tell us. God creates the universe for us. And we get so far along in our scientific progress that we think, who are we? We're just meaningless specks of dust floating around on a larger speck of dust in the infinity of space. We're in the middle of nowhere, in some far-flung nowhere part of our galaxy, in some nowhere place in the grand scheme of things. What are we? Like dust in the wind, Certainly the cosmos, all of this wasn't created for us. The idealist, and Amit Goswami is saying, nay, it is because of us that this exists. It's because of consciousness that the wave function that is God, I'm going to say, the infinite potential, could be collapsed into this physical place that we exist, in this form. It is because of us directly. It is our consciousness. The potential for our consciousness is the thing we're calling God, essentially. The consciousness that exists in that transcendent realm, that as a possibility, that collapses it and make it real. That's us. That's consciousness. We're the self-created thing, and it's self-referential. The potential for consciousness creates the consciousness that collapses the wave function and makes the world. That's self-reference, self-experience, consciousness experiencing itself. It's this process of cosmic ontological feedback. It's amazing. The cosmos was created for our sake. And that brings me to the next section. We're getting close to the end. This one I'm going to call self-reference, tangled hierarchies, and the many from the one. And it begins like this. Because in idealism, consciousness is unitive, right? Consciousness is all there is. One might well ask why and how the sense of separateness arises. If everything is consciousness, why do I feel like I'm a different consciousness than you? Why do I feel like I'm different from the couch and the family dog and the world? If everything is consciousness and there's only one, what's the business of separateness and individuality? What is that all about? So unity and separateness are a paradox. This is just like that unifying opposites idea, the Ouroboros we were talking about. It's a paradox. So Amit is going to give us the explanation for how individualness exists, if everything is truly all one. And he's going to do it using a paradox. So we're going to talk about a famous paradox called the liar's paradox. And it goes something like this. This man, Epimenides, is a Cretan who says, all Cretans are liars. Is he telling the truth? That's the question. Epimenides is a Cretan, and he says, all Cretans are liars. So how do we know if he's telling the truth? How can we answer that question? Amit says, if he's telling the truth, then all Cretans are liars, so he's lying. Well, that's a contradiction, isn't it? If he's lying, then all Cretans are not liars, and he may be telling the truth, which is also a contradiction. If all Cretans are liars, he can't be telling the truth. He says, to get to this paradox, you have to look at the liar's paradox in the form of a mathematical equation. And he just spells it out real simply. X is equal to -1 over x. And I'll try to keep the math to a minimum. I know you can't see it. So x is equal to -1 over x. So he says if you try the solution, x equals 1, the equation will give you back -1. If you try -1 instead of 1, then it comes back +1. And it doesn't matter, right? It's going back and forth between 1 and -1. He says the solution oscillates between 1 and -1, just like the yes-no oscillation of the liar's paradox. He says, but try the solution x equals I, however, and the equation now gives I both times. Thus I, which is called an imaginary number, transcends the paradox. So that's the limit of the math, you guys. So just to talk about I for a second. So I is an imaginary number. This is not just like an arbitrary thing. So you know, if you don't know what an imaginary number is, it's something that results when you take the square root of a negative number. It's kind of an interesting mathematical reality. It's not really possible to take the square root of a negative number, but if you pretend it is, using this what they call imaginary number, it actually has real mathematical applications. It's something that we use to describe waveforms and light. We use in all kinds of interesting ways in physics. It's actually useful. But these are not real numbers. They're imaginary numbers. What does that mean? Okay, real numbers can be represented and plotted, right? If you're going to plot something on a number line in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, a real number can be plotted. Imaginary numbers can't. So where are they? If they can't be plotted, where are they? They're real and they're not real, right? They're transcendent numbers, right? They can't be plotted because they exist not in the realm of the plot. They exist in a transcendent space, right? So this is what he's done. He's introduced the idea of transcendence to overcome the paradox. And it's interesting because this is a real, tangible way of demonstrating how transcendence actually exists. And we actually use it in math, and it has actual applications. Another thing about this that I find interesting is we talked about the Mandelbrot set and fractal geometry before many times. The Mandelbrot set is an equation that results in fractal geometry that transforms. It's an infinite fractal geometry. It's amazing. And fractal geometry is a trademark of nature. The shapes in nature, the shapes of mountains and rivers and branches, and all of that is all the result of fractal mathematics, or can be described by fractal mathematics. And the Mandelbrot set is based on an equation that feeds back on itself. So you get this idea of self-reference that we've been talking about. Every result from the equation gets fed back in, excuse me, as the starting place of another round of calculations. And this is why it's infinite. It just goes on and on and on, but it references itself over and over. And the Mandelbrot set, it's a simple equation. Also requires, in fact, I, the imaginary number. It requires this transcendent representation. I don't know what that means. I mean, I could speculate, but I'll let you do that yourself. He says, the liar's paradox refers to itself. That's how you get caught in its infinite delusion. We are dealing with self-referential systems. The tangled hierarchy is a way of achieving self-reference. He says the self arises because of an infinite oscillation that prevents us from seeing through the veil. That prevents us from seeing what's really there, right? Every time I try to look, boom, the wave functions collapse and I'm not seeing the real thing. He says a tangled hierarchy comes back to the original point where it starts, comes back to itself, right? You get that feedback to begin its oscillation again, and thus perpetuate the attention of the viewer to itself. Let me say that again. In a tangled hierarchy, it always comes back to itself like feedback to begin that oscillation again from -1 to +1, from yes to no, from wave to particle. It's always doing that over and over and over again, and it brings the attention of the viewer, of the observer, of the experiencer, again and again to itself. I know it's probably as clear as mud. Let me try to say it differently. It leaves itself, right? It starts in one place and comes back to itself. This is like that circle, that Ouroboros. When it leaves itself, it's separated. It becomes dissociated from itself. It's left itself. So it's no longer what it once was. It's no longer itself. It's left. It's to be fed back, eventually back onto itself. So when it leaves itself, it becomes dissociated, only to return again to itself, which it is, but now seems to think it isn't. You see what I mean? It reminds me of a line from, was it Hegel or Heidegger? I can't remember, where it says the self has before, or this, it says self-consciousness has before itself another self-consciousness. So that quote's always stuck with me. So again, the thing leaves itself only to come back. And by the time it reaches itself again, it's different from the self that started, right? It has this separation or dissociation or distinction from itself, even though it's no different. It's coming back to itself. So now it seems to be something other than itself, even though It's never been anything different. And Amit says, out of that discontinuity, out of that separation or dissociation, comes self-reference, self-making, or autopoiesis. That's a brilliant word I left in because I never heard it before. It means to be self-created. Consciousness collapses the quantum state, resulting in the separation of subject and object from itself, right? Because of the tangled hierarchy, consciousness identifies itself with the I of the self-reference. But our consciousness is beyond the subject-object split. So when I say it leaves itself, you can imagine this is consciousness with a capital C. Maybe you can call this God. Only to come back around to itself, to experience itself again. And every circulation of that is this illusion of dissociation or separation. When it leaves itself, it's something different. And what it's coming back to is something it's never seen before. But it's fucking self. It's self-reference. It's circular. It's self-experience. If consciousness is all there is, and consciousness experiences, then it's always experiencing itself. This is that circular fractal magic that we see in the Mandelbrot set. And in quantum physics. He says consciousness collapses the quantum state, resulting in the separation of subject and object. So now I'm God consciousness, who no longer thinks I'm God. I think I'm some other consciousness. Subject, object. And now when I come back to experience my original self, I'm no longer that same subject. I'm looking at myself as though I'm an object. And because of that tangled hierarchy, consciousness identifies with the I of the self-reference. And this is an explanation for the ego. This is an explanation for why we think we're individual selves and not the unity, not the unifying consciousness that we came from and really are and have been all along. It's the self-reference, the self-experience that creates the subject-object divide. That's why I can never see the pure reality. Every time I look, the wave function is collapsed. There's always this separation. Every collapse is a separation. This is like the stills in the movie picture, the in-between spaces that I can't see. He says, subject and object manifest simultaneously in the initial collapse of the quantum state. Subject and object manifest simultaneously. Where have I heard that before? Oh yes. You remember when Jordan Peterson was talking about the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, who studied children and how they develop their sense of self. And he said this. He said, knowledge does not begin in the I. By that he means the subject. Knowledge does not begin in the I, and it does not begin in the object. It begins in the interactions. Then there is a reciprocal and simultaneous construction of the object on one hand and the subject on the other. Man. And that brings me to my conclusion. And I'm going to end really succinctly here. I don't want to drag this on. I want to end with a quote that Amit uses in the book that I couldn't find a good spot for, and I think this is as good as any. It's a quote from a very mystical scientist, a mathematician, who I'm going to have to look into. His name is G. Spencer Brown. And he says, we cannot escape the fact that the world we know is constructed in order to see itself. But in order to do so, evidently, it must first cut itself up into at least one state which sees, and at least one other which is seen.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.